What's up, guys? This is Adam from Slurv, Ship My Money on DraftKings, and I'm going to be going over today's pitching slate for you. I'm going to start off with a couple of safer options that are playable in cash games and then move into some riskier GPP plays that I like for tonight. I mainly play DraftKings, so unless I specify otherwise, anything I say pricing related has to do with DraftKings. So the first guy I'm going to start off with, just the clear number one play of the night, is Noah Syndergaard against the Reds at home. Syndergaard, just he's having a phenomenal year so far. Strikes out everybody. The Reds don't strike out a ton, but with Syndergaard, that just doesn't really matter. The Reds haven't been hitting righties. They were 295 WOBA and 78 WRC plus so far this season against righties, and I just don't expect that to change against Syndergaard. He's a minus 220 favorite in a game with a 6.5 over under. He's just the safest play of the night. He's priced at 11,400 on both sites actually. On FanDuel, it's a little bit more than Bumgarner. On DraftKings, it's less, and I just think he's the clear number one option in pretty much any format. He's got the upside for GPPs, and he's got a really high floor for cash games. The other pitcher I like in cash games tonight is Rick Porcello at 8,100 on DraftKings. He's come out really strong so far this year. He's been showing some strikeout upside. He's always been a decent pitcher, gets a lot of ground balls, doesn't give up a whole lot of hard contact, and then he's been showing more strikeout upside this season. But he gets a matchup with the Braves in Atlanta, so he moves to a more pitcher-friendly park than Fenway. And the Braves are striking out almost 22% of the time against righties this season with a 280 WOBA and 70 WRC plus. And Porcello is a minus 145 favorite in a game with a total of 8. So the total's a little, higher than you might like, but his price is just, I think, too low facing a Braves team that is just terrible and can't hit. And, he's a heavy favorite to get the win. So I think he's a good, SP2 on DraftKings today. And moving over to the GPPs, I have a couple plays in each pricing tier that can probably differentiate you a little bit from the field. Bumgarner, I didn't mention in cash just because I'm still not convinced that he's completely healthy, but he is facing a Padres team who, so far this year, they've hit well against lefties, but I don't really expect that to stay that way throughout the season. Plus, most of the right-handed power on that team has faced him a lot and just been terrible against him. I think he's a good GPP play because Syndergaard's just going to be massively owned, and with people trying to get Coors Field exposure, it's going to be really hard for people to have Syndergaard and Bumgarner. So I think Bumgarner's ownership is going to be lower than it probably should be against the Padres. Like, I still think he'll be popular, just not as popular as he should be. I'm just worried about him velocity wise. His four seamer is about 1.5 miles per hour slower so far this year than it was last year, and it's 1 mile per hour slower than his career averages, and it's the same for his two seam fastball. And he was horrible in spring training. He's had a couple bad starts this year, so I think there's definitely just risk with him. Like, I'm just not convinced he's completely healthy, but facing this Padres team at probably lower ownership than he should be at, I think he's a good GPP play. And the same goes for Danny Salazar at 10,700. He's a minus 145 favorite. He's facing a Twins team that hits righties pretty well, but they also strike out. They've been striking out 24% of the time against righties. Salazar doesn't have heavy splits. He strikes out between 24-25% of guys he faces, lefties or righties. So this is a spot where, with Syndergaard just commanding a ton of ownership, and then Bumgarner also, at the top getting a lot of ownership, Salazar is probably not going to be that highly owned, and he's just got a ton of upside facing a Minnesota team who played, I think it was 14 or 15 innings last night, and then traveled from DC back to Minnesota in a pitcher's park where, granted, the Twins do generally play better there, but it's a spot where I think you can really get a lot of upside at $700 less than Syndergaard and $1,300 less than Bumgarner, and he won't be as highly owned as he should be either, I wouldn't think. In the middle tier, I was between Taijuan Walker at 9,000 and Kennedy at 8,800. I think they're both decent GPP plays. I definitely like Walker more. Walker, I don't think will be that highly owned because Houston just has a really good offense, so people aren't gonna really target him. But I think he's a great GPP play because he gets a good amount of strikeouts. Strikes out about 22% of batters he faces. He's facing a Houston team that hits righties really well, but they also strike out. Last year they struck out a ton. This year they're striking out 26% of the time against righties. He's a fly ball pitcher, but the game's at Safeco, so where I might be trying to get like a sneaky Astros stack against him if this was in Houston. In Safeco, just a lot of those fly balls are going to end up being caught, and I think he just has a ton of upside at 9,000. He's a minus 145 favorite. The over/under in the game is only 7.5. So Vegas isn't expecting a ton of runs to be scored. Houston played an extra inning game with Boston and now is flying, to the West Coast. So I think Walker's got a ton of upside, whereas Kennedy's got upside just because he can strike people out, and the Angels suck. But as bad as the Angels have sucked, they haven't been striking out a whole lot this year. And I think Kennedy will probably be targeted a little bit more. He's been owned higher than I expected his last couple of starts. And I think facing an Angels team that has been really bad this year and priced only 200 less than Walker, I think people will probably gravitate more toward Kennedy than they will toward Walker. So I would definitely prefer Walker between the two. And then in the lower price tier on DraftKings, I'm looking at Nate Eovaldi and Drew Pomeranz. I don't love either of them, but if you're going to go for Coors hitters, they both have some upside and can give you salary relief. Eovaldi at 6,400, I think really has a lot of upside against Texas. Texas has been a pretty league average team against righties so far this year, but they do strike out 20%, and Eovaldi so far has been showing decent strikeout upside. So at that price, I think he's a reasonable play. I wouldn't like him as much if he was, more in like the 7.5 range, but down at 6.4, like he can give up some runs and still give you a decent outing as long as your hitters go off. Pomeranz, I would not touch on FanDuel. The win's just so important on FanDuel, and he's a huge underdog in this game. But on DraftKings, where you need the two starting pitchers, and the win doesn't factor in as much. The Giants strike out 20% so far this year against lefties, which is much worse than their like 14.5% rate against righties. So I think the lefties have a little bit more upside. Pomeranz strikes out a good amount of lefties, over the last couple of years. And most of the hitters, or at least half the hitters on the Giants that, you really think will do damage are lefties. So I think it's a decent spot to just grab Pomeranz at, 6.6. He was really highly owned his last start. I think that should be maybe down a little bit just because of people playing Bumgarner and not playing them against each other. But, which honestly I don't even think is a bad move. Like, you're not trying to get the win out of Pomeranz if you play Pomeranz in this matchup. So I'd even be okay, putting them against each other if it helps you get, hitters you really like. So between the two of them, I'd probably lean Eovaldi just because I think he'll be lower owned. But I think they're both reasonable GPP plays. And so now I want to go toward the pitchers I'll probably be targeting, with my bats. I'm not going to go into the Coors game just because I think everybody knows that you can take hitters from the Pirates or the Rockies. Especially the Pirates bullpen's burned up now. So it's going to be a high-scoring game, and, you should definitely have exposure to it. But to take down, GPPs, especially in baseball where variance is so high, it's just so good to find, stacks that people aren't going to be on. And so with all the ownership on Coors, there's a few teams, that I'll be looking to that's, just trying to differentiate my lineup and also let me get in, two of those more expensive pitchers, whereas I think, people are going to have, one stud and one cheap pitcher in a lot of lineups. I can, make up some ground if I have two studs that have big games. And so, my main stack that isn't Coors Field, I want to target the Rangers pitchers tomorrow. Cole Hamels was scratched, so they're going to be starting Cesar Ramos, who in his career has made 251 appearances and 10 of them have been starts. So I'm not expecting him to go deep in this game at all. The Texas bullpen this year has been absolutely horrible. They've given up 14 home runs in 56 innings, and while that probably will regress, it isn't sustainable. They as a whole have a 36.7% hard contact rate and a 34.5% fly ball rate. So that is going to lend itself to a lot of home runs. The game's in Texas, so it's a good spot for hitters. I looked at the pricing real quick on DraftKings, and the Yankees hitters are just incredibly underpriced because they're, I'm assuming, priced for Cole Hamels and not for Cesar Ramos and a bunch of terrible relievers out of the Rangers bullpen. So that's a game I'm definitely going to target, and it's just they're not going to be as highly owned as they should be because everyone's going to be on Colorado, Pittsburgh. Plus, it's a 13-game slate, so ownership's just going to be down anyway because it's just going to be spread out. Outside of the Yankees, I think the Orioles have a lot of upside against Chris Archer. He hasn't been himself this year. He's made 4 starts. He's sucked in 2 of them. One of them was against the Orioles. He's got a good WOBA and xFIP throughout his career, but he does have a pretty high hard contact percentage and pretty high fly ball percentage. So when he's off, he'll give up home runs, he'll give up runs, and for however much you want to weight BVP, the Orioles have some guys that have hit him pretty well. Davis, Machado, and Scope all with OPSs over 1,000 against them. So that's a spot where, the Orioles are always just capable of just throwing up a massive amount of runs. So I think that's a good spot to target. I also like the Indians against Tommy Malone. They've been terrible against lefties so far this year, but if you look at their lineup, they're probably going to run 8 right-handed batters out there. Malone's a terrible pitcher in general, really bad against righties, 335 WOBA since 2014 against righties. And there's not really a reason that the Indians have been so bad against lefties this year. Most of their lineup over their career, they just have good numbers against righties, and so they're just not going to be owned. I don't know how much exposure I'll have to them just because there are spots I like better, but I definitely think the Indians are going to be a nice contrarian stack tomorrow that could put up a lot of runs against Malone and then kind of a shaky Twins bullpen. And Malone's not good against lefties either, so I think Kipnis is in play too if you're doing, a full stack. And then I don't plan on stacking against Iglesias or against Doug Fister, but if you're, just looking for like a one-off or a couple guys to fill out your lineup, lefties on the Mets against Iglesias are going to be in a really nice spot. He's got a 330 WOBA against lefties, but the thing that really stands out for him is against righties, his K rate is almost 34%. It drops down to about 16% against lefties. So he's just not going to strike these guys out, and the Mets have good ones. They've got guys that can hit righties, and they probably won't be that highly owned because nobody really picks on Iglesias, especially on a 13-game slate. And then Fister against the Mariners, I don't think he's as bad of a pitcher as like a lot of people do, but he's definitely not good either. Against righties, he gets a decent amount of ground balls and doesn't give up a bunch of hard contact. But against lefties, he's got almost a 40% fly ball rate, and he gives up a little bit more hard contact. So that's a spot where, the Mariners have, some good lefties with Cano, Seager, mainly those two because they pinch hit for the other ones later in the game. But, so I wouldn't full stack against them, I don't think, especially with it being in Seattle. But if you're looking for a second baseman or third baseman, to fill out your stacks, I think Seager and Cano are going to be great plays against Fister tomorrow. So that's pretty much it. Those are some pitchers that I like in cash and GPP, and then some guys that I definitely am planning on targeting. Make sure you head over to slurve.com and, just chat about strategy, your lineups, whatever you want to do. I'll be popping in there to, answer questions and just talk about stuff generally for a little bit before lock tomorrow. So hope you enjoyed the video, and definitely, head over to Slurve and give some feedback. Good luck tonight.